Today's presentation will hopefully achieve three things. Firstly, I want to explain Hartmut Rosa's account of late modernity, specifically the problem of social acceleration. Secondly, I'd like to explain why Rosa proposes the concept of resonance as important in finding a solution. And finally, I'd like to think about the ways in which the concept of resonance may be applied in political theory. Hartmut Rosa's sociological theory of resonance cannot be fully explained without first acknowledging its relationship to his prior theory of social acceleration. As Rosa contends in the opening passages of Resonance, if acceleration is the problem, then resonance may well be the solution. Social acceleration can be understood as the dynamic stabilization of our economic condition required to merely maintain our current social system. For Rosa, late modernity is a condition of being trapped in a relentless speeding up of our processes for the sake of economic growth. Described as a systematic tendency towards escalation, Rosa maintains that such material conditions cause a fundamental transformation of our social relationship to both time and space. It is hardly surprising that Rosa suggests such an escalatory framework leads to, quote, problematic, even dysfunctional or pathological relationships to the world on the part of both subjects and society as a whole. The self-determination of subjects in late modernity plays out within our socio-economic context, and as such, the institutionalized structural elements become inevitable influences on how we see the world and ourselves. Dynamic stabilization, the result of social acceleration, and competition, the ideological imposition required to generate the motivational energies needed to fulfill the former imperative for growth, constitute the background noise of everyday economic and cultural life. Rosa argues that late modernity may be characterized as an age of open ethical horizons. It is assumed we are entitled to learn for ourselves what constitutes the good life, and the fact of ethical privatization, which has made the task of determining one's purpose in life into a nearly insoluble problem, leads to a near ubiquitous self-determination. In a world which requires us to increase our speed and compete for resources in the background, and that leaves us free to think the good life as a personal quest for meaning in the foreground, our cultural condition lends itself to the dominant conclusion that we must assess the value of our own lives in terms of our ability to accumulate resources. For Rosa, more specifically, the obligation to make something of oneself, to care for oneself, be active, and conquer one's weaker self may be the highest moral imperative in modern society. It is from this theoretical deliberation that Rosa's project becomes a sociological theory of resonance. Resonance is a tricky concept to pin down, with Rosa focusing on instances of its emergence and often telling us what it is not in anticipation of objections. For example, Rosa contends that resonance appears in our capacity for sympathy and empathy when we interact and cooperate and maintain meaningful relationships with others. Resonance is described as manifesting as a multidimensional process between the physical and mental aspects of the subject, between self and world, represented in dynamic moments of encounter or mutual address. Rosa defines the world in this theory as everything that is encountered or that can be encountered, the open totality within which things happen, objects are found, and subjects can experience. The subject in question is defined as having an inherent openness to the world in a way that an object cannot, a distinctive condition of consciously and unconsciously relating to the world through perception. Subjects experience themselves as situated in a world that addresses them. We look at the world and things speak to us, attract us, or repel and disgust us. Thus, we may affix a qualitative assessment of our relationship to the world established by the fact we desire that which appears in the world as desirable, or we are repulsed by that which appears repellent. And it is an assessment of these series of determinations that forms the contours of subject and world. Resonance is not a relationship of legal or economic possession, nor does it refer to an emotional or affective state. Rather, it is a mode of relation that remains open to emotional content. So let's provide an example. For me, resonance straddles both the act of being moved by art and the open disposition of a subject willing to be moved by art. Is there anything more annoying than someone derailing a conversation to show you something funny on their phone when you want to broach a serious topic with them? As anyone who has perhaps too enthusiastically recommended a TV show, film, or song to a friend will attest, often the quality of media is undermined by the resistance of a closed mind. We all know that we often need to be in the right mood to truly appreciate certain things. either because other priorities are dominating our affective state or because certain forms require more effort on our part, a commitment to meeting it halfway. Rosa explains relations of resonance through a spatial analogy of mutual oscillatory adjustment as observed between celestial bodies, which intends to drive home the hermeneutical particularities of each resonant relation. When you read a novel, your reading is distinctive, especially if it speaks to you, and if it does leave its mark on you, it will do so in a way specific to you, as each reader comes upon the text from a different subject position. Resonance is both descriptive and normative, understood as a basic human capacity and need, from which Rosa claims we may draw two descriptive conclusions. Human subjectivity and social intersubjectivity basically develop via the establishment of fundamental resonant relationships. Resonance is normative insofar as it is used to qualitatively assess how well our lives are going or how successful a society is as allowing its citizens to flourish. And at this point, Rosa moves from a descriptive account of something that subjects can and are wont to do to an account of something subjects ought to be encouraged to do, the possibility of which is dependent on the existence of mutually accommodating resonant spaces. Resonance is not to be understood as a constant state of contentment or a continuous ecstatic subjectivity. Rather, it refers to significant events, that flash of a connection to a source of strong evaluations in a predominantly silent and often repulsive world. Ideal social conditions allow for the flourishing of axes of resonance, instances where the world strikes a chord with the subject, and in turn the world may respond accordingly. It is Rosa's contention that subjects desire the capacity to both generate and experience resonance. To use another musical analogy, a songwriter resonates with the process of creation, but they're also receptive to brilliant songs written by others, occasional flashes of jealousy aside. It is through these positive axes of resonance that subjects may affirm their sense of purpose and agency. They can see themselves in the world and identify aspects of the world with their own sense of self. By contrast, Rosa suggests a correlation between low expectations of self-efficacy and the feelings of powerlessness, lack of control, lack of attachment to others, and the absence of emotional investment in the world that characterizes classical sociological accounts of alienation. And Rosa considers resonance to be the other of alienation. Politicizing resonance. If, as individuals, we are compelled to desire resonant relationships with others and the world, it may follow that society ought to be organised in such a way as to maximise the proximity of subjects to moments of resonance and foster conditions that would proliferate such experiences. Nevertheless, Rosa is reluctant to make the case for an explicit politics of resonance, but is open to the notion of a resonant politics, in the sense that democratic participation could well be improved by creating political institutions and procedures that affirm a sense of agency and solidarity in citizens. Rosa's resonance theory intends to provide a normative framework from which new spaces and possibilities of being in the world are opened up, in hopes of informing experimental resonant oases for new types of social experiences. Resonance theory lends itself to political opposition to the privatisation of public space, the division of spaces into strictly industrial and commercial zones, and other ways in which public space is constructed and reproduced in such a way that limits its social experience. Generally speaking, resonant spaces are open-ended. They allow individuals to enter an encounter without an express preconceived intention of how such a space ought to be interpreted or used. Recalling the notion of resonance as the other to alienation, we may turn to John Medeiros' vision of oppositional democracy and find resonance to be a valuable heuristic concept. Medeiros argues that the predominant form of democratic action ought to be opposing alienation, the tendency of our common activities to escape our common control and reproduce malign social structures and forces. Medeiros' focus on democracy as a site of struggle ought to be understood as an attempt to circumvent the distinction sometimes made between ideal and non-ideal theorizing, and his oppositional account is not intended to conceive of democracy as, quote, some pure practice that can only be expected to thrive in the distant future, or that can only be conceived imaginatively. Medeiros' pragmatic view is simple but effective. Democratic action ought to oppose alienation, which is caused by domination. Domination describes a situation in which an agent, group, social force or social structure overshadows or overwhelms some people's capacity to act, imposes necessities on them, or systematically resists their attempts to regulate important spheres of life. Alienation in this formulation is the consequence of domination, as, quote, their common action returns to people in the form of social forces, relations, or institutions that dominate some or all of them and enable some people to oppress or exploit others, end quote. Alienation, therefore, is the production of an aggregation that may even involve an individual's participation in the action that caused the overall negative consequence. Recall dynamic stabilization and our need to accumulate resources. Medeiros understands alienation and democratic action as sharing a common ground, as interacting poles that cannot be fully understood without a grasp of the other, as, quote, one cannot theorize democratic action without positing the prerequisite for it, and so the possibility of alienation. Nor can one theorize alienation without the generative conditions of democratic action. Oppositional democracy, therefore, may be framed as a politics of de-escalation, as necessarily opposed to social acceleration by way of its contribution to domination at the structural level in terms of dynamic stabilization. There are also interesting research avenues in exploring the relationship between resonance and public space. Space itself must be constructed and configured to support democratic culture. In response to theories that overemphasize digital political communication, John R. Parkinson reminds us that the things that are communicated involve real people who take up, occupy, share, and contest physical space. Parkinson argues that democratic activity depends on the availability of physical public spaces, and that the availability of these spaces must be defended. Parkinson focuses on the physical conditions of democracy rather than its cultural conditions, defining public space as openly accessible, using common resources, having common effects, and or used for the performance of public roles. He characterizes democratic performance as the narrations of interests, opinion, and experience, the making of public claims, deciding upon those claims, and accounting for decisions and actions. Parkinson is sceptical of the public-private distinction and argues that the dominance of large commercial interests in the production of space contributes to the retrenchment of civic activity and the normalization of consumer approaches to public life. The neoliberal privatization and policing of public space changes the way individuals engage with their communities, seeing themselves as shoppers, sports fans, and consumers rather than citizens. For example, the high street is a place where the expectation is that you will part with money, or may even be moved along, deemed suspicious, if not fully engaged in the practice of commerce. Parkinson concludes with a suggestion of initiatives for encouraging democratic performance in public space, including heavily subsidised public transport, the public provision of meeting rooms and designated spaces for public claim-making purposes, a balance between the preservation of memory and commemoration and dynamic features that allow citizens to feel as though they can influence urban architecture, which in turn presupposes an open and publicly accountable planning regime. Citizens are then empowered to reconfigure the space in which further democratic demands will be made and everyday life will be lived. The language of resonance in the context of public space immediately calls to mind contemporary debates regarding gentrification, ghettoization, and the increasing encroachment of special economic zones in the global south.